What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I got labeled a failure on a Sunday night, and less than 30 days later, I had already set in motion the plan that would make me the owner of the very company my brother bragged about while laughing at me across the table. It sounds dramatic, but it started in the most ordinary way, a family dinner that was supposed to be casual, predictable, and safe, except it turned into a public showcase of how little respect my brother had for me. We were sitting there, all of us, and Evan was in one of his usual moods where every story he told had him at the center as the hero, the hustler, the one making all the right moves while everyone else supposedly wasted time. He went on and on about new projects his company had taken on, how he was growing faster than the competitors, how the community knew his name. Nobody asked for details about numbers or margins, because when he performed like that, the family just smiled and nodded, acting like he was some kind of local celebrity. And then he turned his attention to me, leaned back in his chair, and with a laugh that made my stomach twist, called me a failure. He did not say it quietly. He said it in that way people do when they want the whole table to hear, when they want the silence after to seal the insult into the air. He said I had been drifting for years, taking on little consulting jobs here and there without building anything real, without a big office or a staff or trucks with my name on the side. The way he put it, I was the family disappointment, and he was the proof of what success looked like. My parents tried to smooth it over with awkward chuckles, telling him to be nice, but they did not defend me either. And the worst part was that some of my relatives laughed along, as if they were relieved it was me being targeted and not them. In the past, I would have tried to argue back, to prove myself right in the moment, to list out the clients I had helped or the money I had saved, but that night something inside me clicked. I kept my mouth shut. I let him talk. I let him think he had won. And when the check came, I did something I had never done before. Normally I picked it up because I had a steady flow of consulting work and felt guilty about making my parents cover it, but this time I folded my hands and stayed still. Evan's eyes darted at me, expecting me to grab it like always, but I did not move. Let him pay for once. I went home with a strange kind of calm, the kind that does not come from swallowing anger but from redirecting it. Instead of replaying his words all night, I opened my laptop and started digging. My brother loved to brag, but bragging often covers up cracks, and I wanted to see if the cracks were real. I looked up state business filings, vendor liens, public records. It is amazing what you can find when you stop feeling small and start treating someone's claims like data to verify. Within an hour, I found notices that his company had multiple mechanics liens filed against recent projects. Subcontractors had complained about late payments. A couple of online reviews described clients waiting months for completion while crews bounced between jobs. The next day, I mentioned all of this casually to my friend Nora, who flips small businesses for a living. She laughed when I told her Evan's empire was behind on payments, not because it was funny, but because she knew exactly what that meant. Companies that grow too fast without stable cash flow are like balloons stretched too thin. They look impressive, but the air inside is unstable, and one wrong move makes them collapse. Nora told me to look deeper, especially for the lender. If I found who financed his projects, I might find out how fragile his house of cards really was. So I kept digging. It was not glamorous work, just coffee, spreadsheets, and late nights of reading filings that most people never bother with. But then I found it. A uniform commercial code filing that listed a regional lender with a blanket lien on his company's assets. That meant his trucks, his equipment, even his receivables were pledged as collateral. It also meant that if the company stumbled, the lender would be the one calling the shots, and lenders often prefer to sell off risky loans rather than ride them down. I sat back, staring at that document, and I realized I had something far more valuable than a snappy comeback at a dinner table. I had a pathway to real power. Instead of wasting another breath trying to change the minds of people who enjoyed tearing me down, I could take their favorite narrative, Evan as the successful one, me as the failure, and flip it completely. Not through yelling, not through petty arguments, but through leverage. That night, I drafted a message to Nora. It was short and simple, but it said everything. If the bank wants out, I want in. And that was the moment everything shifted. When I woke up the morning after sending that message to Nora, I half expected to feel foolish for even entertaining the thought of stepping into my brother's world, but instead I felt strangely clear. Like someone had finally turned down the noise of family politics and turned up the volume on reality, because instead of replaying his smirk and that awful word, failure, I found myself thinking about contracts, lenders, and the fact that the person who holds the debt is the one who quietly holds the steering wheel. Nora called me later that day, and in her usual blunt but oddly reassuring way, she said, "If you are serious, then you need to understand one thing before anything else. Debt is not just numbers on a page. Debt is leverage. And whoever holds it decides whether a company sinks, floats, or changes captains." She explained it simply enough that I could follow without feeling like I was drowning in financial jargon. Companies like Evans, that expand too fast with thin margins, often take out loans that cover payroll and vendors, and when those loans sour, banks or regional lenders are often more than happy to offload them to anyone willing to take on the risk for a discount. She told me that people like her buy distressed companies not out of spite, but because it can be profitable if you know what you are doing, and she looked at me with a raised eyebrow, as if silently asking whether my motivation was revenge, profit, or both. I told her the truth. I did not want to ruin my brother for the sake of it, but I was tired of being humiliated, tired of being treated like a failure while he strutted around on top of a shaky foundation. And if the opportunity was there to not only protect myself, but also show him that the person he ridiculed could turn out to be the one holding the cards, then I would be damned if I was going to walk away. Nora nodded and said, "Then we start small. We gather information the way an investor would, not the way a sibling would." So that is exactly what I did. I began by calling subcontractors under the pretense of looking for potential partners for a project. It was not difficult to get them talking, because contractors rarely sugarcoat things, and the stories they told lined up with the records I had already seen. One said, "We show up only if we see the check clear first, because Reed's promises are worth less than paper right now." Another muttered that they had been juggling his jobs with other clients because his payments came weeks late, and though he had a flashy brand, his reputation behind the scenes was far less polished than what he fed the family at dinner. I made notes, built a spreadsheet, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a surge of confidence not rooted in defending myself, but in actually having tangible evidence, not just family gossip or my own feelings. Each line item of delayed payments, each lien, each frustrated vendor became another piece of a puzzle that showed the truth. Evan was not running an empire. He was running a cash-strapped circus, and the clowns were ready to walk out if the ringmaster missed another payday. Nora introduced me to a lawyer she trusted, Arjun Patel, who specialized in these kinds of transactions. He explained that if I could identify the senior debt, the loan with first rights over assets, I could position myself to take control if the company defaulted. He warned me that it was not simple or quick, and that it would require real money, contracts, and patience. But he also said something that stuck with me. The person your brother mocked for being a failure might turn out to be the only person capable of saving the employees he is stringing along, and the irony is, no one will see it coming until the documents are already signed. Still, the idea felt surreal, and part of me wondered if I was letting anger guide me too far, but then the next piece of proof arrived like fate confirming my suspicion. Grace Liu, a portfolio manager at the regional lender whose name appeared on those lien filings, finally responded to an email I had sent days earlier. Her message was brief, professional, and carefully worded, but it told me everything. "If you are a serious buyer for the note, please come prepared with counsel. We are reviewing options this quarter." That one sentence meant the bank was tired of the risk and ready to cut their losses, and if I had the courage and the paperwork, I could become the one they handed the reins to. That night I sat in silence at my kitchen table, staring at the email, thinking about every moment my brother had spoken down to me, every time my parents had smiled at him while ignoring me, every family holiday where he was the golden child and I was the quiet afterthought. I realized I was holding something bigger than revenge. I was holding the potential to walk into his world not as the sister he dismissed, but as the creditor he could not ignore. And the strangest part was that, instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt steady, because I knew that if I moved carefully, step by step, there was no need to raise my voice, no need to argue, and no need to prove myself with words. The proof would be in the paper, in the contracts, in the signatures. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine a future where I was not explaining who I was to people who never listened, but instead, I was making decisions that would speak louder than anything I could ever say at a dinner table. And as I closed my laptop that night, I realized something simple yet undeniable. The first domino had already tipped, and now it was only a matter of how far I was willing to let the line fall. By the time Grace confirmed that the lender was open to selling the note, I already knew there was no turning back, because what had begun as a reaction to my brother's insult at a dinner table had now taken the shape of a deliberate plan. A plan that was no longer about proving myself to a family that rarely listened, but about seizing an opportunity that most people never even see. And it was in that moment I understood that the smartest revenge is not loud or messy but silent, methodical, and almost boring in the way it hides behind signatures, contracts, and numbers. With Nora's guidance and Patel's steady hand on the legal side, I formed a small holding entity that would serve as the buyer, because in this kind of deal you do not walk in with your personal name attached to it if you can avoid it. You build a structure that speaks the language lenders trust. Patel explained the documents in a way that was direct but respectful, making it clear that if I bought the senior note, I would inherit not only the right to demand repayment, but also the authority to call a default and take control of assets if the terms were broken, which in Evan's case was not a matter of if but when. The irony was almost comical. Evan's so-called empire was being held together by borrowed money, by promises he could no longer keep. And the very bank he bragged about having connections with was desperate to hand his debt to someone else before it dragged them down. Grace was professional and distant, but she hinted enough that I understood the timing was perfect, because the lender wanted the exposure off their books, and I was willing to take the risk at a price that favored me. Negotiations stretched over days that felt like months, not because the process was glamorous, but because every word, every clause, and every signature had weight. I wired in earnest money, signed non-disclosure agreements, and sat through conference calls where terms like forbearance, covenant breach, and collateral valuation were tossed around as if they were everyday vocabulary. I will not pretend I understood it all immediately, but what I did understand was this. By the time we reached an agreement, I would hold the very rope my brother had tied around his company's neck. And yet, as satisfying as the thought of control was, I could not shake the reality that Evan's employees, the foreman who had quietly slipped me a thank you note, the project managers stretched thin, the crews waiting on late checks, were not villains in this story. They were collateral damage in his arrogance, and if I was going to do this, I had to find a way to protect them, because destroying him while leaving dozens of people jobless would not be a victory. It would be reckless and cruel. So alongside Patel's legal framework, I worked with Nora to draft a simple but firm operations plan. Payroll first, no exceptions. Client communication cleaned up and made honest. Project schedules triaged so that promises could actually be kept instead of exaggerated. When the bank finally accepted my offer at a discount steep enough that even Nora raised an impressed eyebrow, the shift was immediate because I was no longer just the sister with a grudge. I was the creditor of record, the one who could, with a single notice, change the entire direction of the company. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, because now there was no buffer of theory or speculation, there was only action, and action meant consequences that would ripple far beyond my personal satisfaction. I did not act impulsively. Instead, I waited, letting the reality of the debt sit heavy on Evan's shoulders, because I knew the cracks would show themselves without me lifting a finger, and I was right. Within a week, one of his key suppliers froze shipments, citing past due balances that had stretched too long. That was my opening. Patel drafted the notice of default, citing specific covenant breaches, and with my signature the document became not just a piece of paper, but a declaration that control had shifted, whether my brother realized it yet or not. It is hard to describe the feeling of that moment, because it was not a rush of glee or a cinematic explosion of triumph. It was steadier, colder, more grounded in reality. Like standing on a foundation you had built stone by stone while someone else kept insisting you lived in the clouds. For the first time, I understood what true leverage felt like: quiet, undeniable, and immune to shouting. And as I looked at the plan we had prepared, one that would keep employees paid, vendors informed, and projects stabilized, I realized that my revenge was not just about firing my brother someday. It was about taking the chaos he had built and turning it into something sustainable, something that actually worked, and in doing so, showing him and everyone else that the so-called failure in the family had been paying attention all along. The papers were signed, the supplier freeze was in effect, and the notice of default was ready to be delivered. All that was left was the meeting that would finally bring the truth into the open, the meeting where my brother would learn, not from gossip or argument, but from legal fact, that the power he mocked me for lacking had already been placed directly in my hands. And in that quiet moment before everything unfolded, I promised myself one thing: I would not waste time gloating, because the silence of authority speaks louder than any insult ever could. The day of the meeting arrived with a heaviness that sat on my shoulders from the moment I woke up, not because I was unsure of what I was doing, but because I knew that once I stepped into that room there would be no way to undo the shift that was about to take place. And whatever remnants of family loyalty I had been clinging to would be replaced by a reality that was cold, legal, and final. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, reviewing every clause of the loan documents, every vendor complaint, every payroll schedule that had been stretched past its breaking point, and, while part of me wished this confrontation could have been avoided, the larger part of me understood that it was necessary, not only to protect the employees who had been carrying his company on their backs, but to finally put an end to the narrative where he was the golden child and I was the family failure. We gathered in a plain conference room at the offices of Patel's small firm, a space that was neither glamorous nor intimidating, which I actually preferred, because I wanted the conversation to hinge on facts rather than theatrics. Evan walked in late, as if to prove he was still the one in control, grinning in that self-assured way that had worked for him in family settings, but that was already beginning to look out of place in a room where control was measured not in charm, but in signatures and enforceable rights. He brought with him 2 managers, both clearly uneasy, and he immediately launched into a performance about how his company was growing so fast that vendors could hardly keep up, a story I had heard countless times before. Except this time no one laughed politely or nodded along. Grace from the lender's side sat across the table, calm and professional, and when she opened her folder and slid across the documents Patel had prepared, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, because the words on those pages spelled out a reality that Evan could not talk his way out of. The loan covenants had been breached repeatedly, payments had been missed, collateral was at risk, and under the rights I now held as the note holder, the decision to restructure the company was not his to make anymore. Evan blinked at the documents, then looked around the table for support, first at his managers, then at Grace, then at me, and finally back at Patel, as if waiting for someone to tell him this was a mistake. But silence pressed down on him like a weight he could not shrug off. When he finally found his voice, he laughed, but it was hollow, a nervous sound that filled the room with discomfort rather than authority. He accused me of meddling, called me vindictive, told everyone present that this was just some family feud, but Patel calmly pushed forward, explaining in measured, legal language that the default had been triggered, that the new operating structure was effective immediately, and that an interim operator had already been appointed to stabilize the projects and payroll. I kept my expression steady, not because I wanted to appear cold, but because I knew that if I allowed myself even a flicker of satisfaction, the focus would shift from his failures to my emotions. And I wanted the spotlight fixed firmly on the undeniable fact that his mismanagement had consequences. The managers glanced between us, and I could see relief flickering in their eyes, because while Evan ranted about betrayal and family loyalty, they were thinking about their crews, their deadlines, and the paychecks that kept food on their tables. And in that moment, I realized that the people who mattered most in this room were not the ones who shared my last name, but the ones who had been strung along by his arrogance for far too long. Evan slammed his hand on the table and threatened lawsuits, saying he would take me and the lender down in court, but Patel calmly slid another folder toward him, this one filled with documentation of breaches, signed acknowledgments, and email trails that made it clear that a courtroom would only expose more of what he had been hiding. I looked directly at him then, not with anger, but with the kind of steady calm that comes from knowing you are standing on unshakable ground, and I said, in a voice that was quiet enough to force him to lean in, "You called me a failure in front of everyone who mattered to me, but the truth is, I was the only one paying attention, and now I am the only one who can keep this company from collapsing completely." His face went red, not with shame but with rage, yet the silence in the room after I spoke made it clear that the balance had shifted. As the meeting wrapped up, Patel presented the official termination letter, worded in professional, legal terms, leaving no room for debate. Evan refused to sign, stormed out, and shouted that he would drag me down with him, but the reality was already settled. The cards had been dealt, and I was holding the winning hand. The managers stayed behind, quietly thanking me, one of them even saying that the crews would be relieved to know someone finally cared about stability instead of showmanship. Grace shook my hand, her professional mask never slipping, but I could see the faintest glimmer of approval in her eyes. When I left that conference room, I felt no urge to call anyone or announce my victory, because the real power was not in rubbing it in his face, it was in the fact that the next morning payroll would clear, projects would be reorganized, and the people who had been suffering under his chaos would finally have a reason to believe things could change. And though my phone buzzed with angry calls from my parents, who had already heard Evan's version of the story and accused me of betrayal, I ignored them, because for the first time in my life I understood something simple but profound. Family loyalty means nothing if it requires you to destroy yourself in the process, and sometimes the only way to protect the people who truly depend on you is to stop playing the role of the quiet, forgiving sibling and step fully into the role of the one who finally says enough. By the time the sun rose on the day after the meeting, the noise had already started to swell across my phone and my inbox, because Evan had clearly spent the night converting humiliation into volume, painting himself online as a wronged visionary sabotaged by an ungrateful sister who supposedly could not stand his success. And although the comments from friends of friends and the dramatic messages from relatives carried the usual mix of pity and outrage, what mattered to me was not the chorus of people who loved a good story, but the quiet list of practical tasks that would decide whether the company survived the week. So I turned off notifications, opened the payroll dashboard with Patel's compliance checklist beside me, and pushed through the first run with the kind of deliberate focus that does not feel triumphant but feels solid, which, in moments like this, is far better than triumph. The first calls that morning were not to my parents or to Evan but to vendors who had been living in a holding pattern of broken promises and frayed tempers, and I told them, in plain language and with dates they could write down, exactly when they would see money and exactly what the project sequence would look like under the interim operator, and while a few were understandably bitter and one or two threatened to walk away on principle, most of them took a breath, asked a few direct questions, and said that if the checks landed when I said they would, the crews would show up and the trucks would roll, because in the end, people who build things for a living do not need speeches, they need stability, and they need someone who answers the phone without lying. By midday, 2 large clients who had been teetering between staying and bolting asked for a call, and instead of selling them a dream, I walked them through a plan that was narrow, honest, and executable, which is to say I told them which change orders would be honored, which timelines were being reset rather than faked, and which pieces of work would be reassigned to crews that could actually finish them. And when I ended the call I realized that I had not once mentioned the family drama or the word betrayal, because the only useful thing about this mess was that it had forced me to choose a lane, and I had chosen the one where results did the talking. In the afternoon, Patel returned from the courthouse with a folder that contained what looked at first glance like dull paperwork, but in reality carried the full weight of the power I had been building toward since the night Evan called me a failure. Because inside was the documentation to convert the senior debt into equity with board consent, A move that sounds clinical until you understand that it turns a set of rights on paper into actual ownership, and alongside that conversion sat a retention program for the employees who had kept the skeleton of the company upright while the public face chased attention, a simple, decent structure that promised bonuses for staying through specific milestones and guaranteed that payroll would clear before anyone at the top took a dollar. When the last signature was in place, I mailed a clean severance offer to Evan, not because I wanted to be generous, but because a professional ending is stronger than a loud one. And the letter was written in the same neutral tone as the termination that preceded it, with a sensible payment, a narrow reference that confirmed dates and role without spin, and a clause that expired in 1 week if he continued to smear the company or harass employees, which meant that for the first time in his life, he had to choose between noise and money, and although I did not enjoy forcing that choice, I cannot deny the quiet satisfaction of watching a man who worshipped drama decide whether his pride was worth the cash he always bragged about. My parents called that evening with the kind of brittle urgency I recognized from every moment in childhood when they tried to put out a fire by telling everyone to be nice, and while I love them in the complicated way adults love the people who raised them, I told them calmly that I would not debate the past, and that I would not accept another conversation where my role was to absorb blame while my brother spun stories, and I said that they were welcome in my life if they could accept the boundary that I would not fix anyone's feelings for free anymore, and that I would not fund dinners or holidays or emergencies while being spoken to like a burden, and when I finished, there was a long silence that felt like a door closing and a window opening at the same time, which might be the best description of growing up that I have ever found. Over the next week, the rhythms of work did what they always do when someone with a plan shows up and sticks around, because pay landed when it was promised. Suppliers came back online with measured schedules that matched reality, and the crews who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop began to believe that the sky might stay where it belonged, which is to say above their heads rather than on their backs, and in that slow restoration of sanity I saw something I had not expected to feel so strongly, a sense that the most satisfying revenge is not the defeat of a person, but the repair of a system they broke while everyone applauded. I will not pretend that every piece of the fallout was simple, because Evan posted more than once, and a few relatives chose his version because it made better gossip. And there were nights when I stared at the ceiling wondering whether I had become the exact kind of ruthless operator I used to critique. Yet every time doubt crept in, I came back to the same facts, that people were being paid on time, that clients were getting the truth instead of fantasy, and that the company, flawed as it still was, now had a chance to exist as something other than a stage for a single man's ego, and eventually even my parents softened, not with apologies, because that is not their language, but with practical questions about whether the crews needed more portable heaters for a cold snap and whether the holiday schedule could be adjusted so families would not miss their kids' concerts, which, for them, is as close to a confession as I will ever get. On the final day of the first month under the new structure, I stood in the warehouse that had once been loud with excuses and now hummed with the quieter sounds of tasks being finished in the order they were promised. And I understood that the story I wanted to tell myself about revenge had always been too small, because this was never just about firing a brother who mocked me. It was about proving to myself that the person he called a failure could carry the weight he never bothered to notice, and that the cleanest win is the one that does not need a spotlight, only a ledger that balances, a team that trusts the plan, and a door that I can finally close behind me when I decide the company can walk without me, which it will. Because that is the last move in the game he never realized I was playing, the move where I choose peace over noise, and leave with the satisfaction of knowing that I did not out him, I outgrew him.